مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. سيغادر دونالد ترامب منصبه بعد فترة رئاسية واحدة، فماذا سيكون إرث سياسته الخارجية؟ جورج بوش الذي تولي الرئاسة لفترة واحدة يشتهر بانتصاراته التي حققها في مجال السياسة الخارجية، بداية من انتصاره في حرب الخليج، مرورا بنهاية الحرب الباردة، وصولا إلى إعادة توحيد ألمانيا. جيمي كارتر رئيس آخر لفترة واحدة يشتهر بإخفاقاته في مجال السياسة الخارجية، وخاصة ما نتج عن ملحمة رهائن إيران من حرج. حين يناقش المؤرخون نجاحات وإخفاقات سياسة الرئيس ترامب الخارجية، ماذا سيتصدر كل من هاتين القائمتين لمناقشة أعظم إنجازات وأسوأ أخطاء سياسة دونالد ترامب الخارجية وأثرها على اختيارات المتوفرة لجو بايدن. يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. It's been almost 4 years since Donald Trump took the oath of office and launched an America First foreign policy. 4 years later, his term is coming to an end. How should we evaluate what Donald Trump achieved, his successes, his failures, and the long-lasting implications, if any, of what he did in the Oval Office? To discuss the legacy of Donald Trump's foreign policy, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Denis Ross and Mr. Juan Zarate. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. So, gentlemen, let's begin with the positive. What, in your view, are the 2 or 3 most significant positive achievements of Donald Trump's foreign policy? Denis, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the most significant positive achievement is actually the Abraham Accords. They reflect, and in some ways, you have to give the administration credit for helping to create the circumstances where the landscape of the Middle East is changing. We're seeing normalization now between 4 Arab states and Israel. It promises not just to produce, I think, peace in the region and to use it as a point of departure, but it also deepens the coalition against the Iranians, which I think is also, again, something that one can give the administration some credit for, at least in terms of a regional coalition against the Iranians. There is a kind of ironic reality that Trump, because he's not been prepared to support traditional American alliances, because he hasn't built traditional coalitions, that too creates an interesting positive legacy for I think, President-elect Biden. Our allies see the consequences of when the U.S. doesn't lead. It makes them more mindful that they're probably going to have to assume a greater share of the burden for their own security and for helping others. And that might be an ironic positive thing to talk about. But I think I would summarize it as maybe 3 things. The Abraham Accords, which really helped to change the landscape of the Middle East. Maximum economic pressure on Iran, which again, even though it hasn't changed Iran's behavior at this point, puts the Biden administration in a position where it's pretty clear that Iran's going to have to seek a way to get sanctions relief. And thirdly, in an ironic way, making it clear that when the U.S. doesn't lead, there's a vacuum that's created internationally. We've seen it in terms of how the pandemic has been dealt with. And that reminds everybody that American leadership actually is important. So I think that'll make it easier for our alliances actually to work more effectively and for our allies to realize they actually have to assume a bigger share of the burden if they want us to sustain the kind of leadership that is in all of our interests, including theirs.
All right. So really 2.5 achievements. The third one was not purposeful, I think it's fair to say. Juan, when you look at the world and you look at Trump foreign policy, what do you point at as the most significant positive achievements?
Well, Rob, I tend to agree with Dennis. I think what's interesting is that President Trump shattered certain orthodoxies in the foreign policy domain. Now, some of this was enabled by shifts in the landscape, as Dennis mentioned, shifts that enable the Abraham Accords and a reshift of what we even consider to be Middle East peace, right? So a shattering of orthodoxies. Even the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem shattered a particular boundary in the perception of what could be done in the foreign policy domain. I also think importantly and significantly from a strategic perspective, the confrontation with China has been significant, and the shift toward using American power and influence to challenge China in the economic domain, the technical domain, even on issues of human rights, began to shatter an orthodoxy where China had in the past been a third rail, for example, in the sanctions domain, and really now is a centerpiece of foreign policy. And President Trump was not afraid to be confrontational. The administration took on things like the role of Chinese tech giants Huawei in the telecommunications infrastructure globally.
If President Trump were in this conversation, do you think he would have something else to put on the list? Well, what you've given us is smart analysis. What do you think his top achievements in his own mind would be? Juan, what do you think?
Well, you're right. I think he would mention China. He would certainly mention the Middle East agreements. He would mention maximum pressure against Iran and North Korea. But I do think he would mention three things conceptually. One, the fact that he was willing to talk to North Korea and try to avert war with North Korea, tried to create an opening for dialogue. He touted that for many months as a key achievement of his diplomacy. Some would argue, I would argue, it was a reflection of his hyper-personalized diplomacy and foreign policy, which had its downsides, of course. He would point to withdrawing from the Middle East. So, for example, the withdrawal of troops from Syria, ending the forever wars. That thematic would be central to the way the Trump administration would define itself. And then finally, really having an American-centric view of the world, which is to say we're not going to be entangled or constrained by these multilateral institutions if they're not serving American interests. We are going to be driven by this core concept of state sovereignty. And if it's not good for America, we aren't going to do it. And that, again, abuts against and confronts a more multilateral approach that you're going to see from the Biden administration.
Dennis, anything else that you think would be on the president's own list?
I think Juan's list is a very good one. I guess the one thing I would add is that he would say he produced the NATO allies spending much more on their own security. They never would have done it had he not pressured them the way he did. And I think just put in perspective what Juan is saying, to be fair to Trump, what he reflects is an attitude that does have well springs in the American historical tradition. Prior to World War II, we did not assume responsibilities internationally. It's not that we were inactive or passive. We would pursue our own interests, but we didn't have alliances. We didn't have obligations to others. And what he represents is the view that alliances don't add to American power. They impose obligations on us. They cost us. Why should we pursue things that are in others' interests? I think that is pretty much the point of departure for him and what he defines as American first. But he would claim it's produced not only what Juan was saying, it's produced a readiness on the part of the countries within NATO to pay their fair share.
All right. So I think we've given the president due with a substantial list of achievements. When we come back after the break, Dennis, I'm going to start with you and get your list of President Trump's most damaging and problematic aspects of his foreign policy in just a moment. With his defeat, Donald Trump becomes the 11th president to lose his bid for re-election. Some took it better than others. George H.W. Bush, for example, was magnanimous when defeated by Bill Clinton, declaring famously, "The people have spoken." Others just took defeat as the opening round of the next battle. Perhaps President Trump will draw inspiration from Grover Cleveland, who won the presidency in 1884, lost re-election in 1888, but then ran again and won back the White House in 1892. But if there's one model to which we might turn for Biden versus Trump, it's Jefferson versus Adams in 1800. John Adams, our second president, was the first to lose re-election. He was so distraught about his ignominious defeat that he didn't attend the inauguration of his successor, leaving the president's house at 4 a.m. in the morning on the early public stagecoach for Baltimore. Will Donald Trump attend Joe Biden's inauguration? If he doesn't, he can cite none other than one of our most revered founding fathers as a precedent. Again, my guests today include Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has 25 years of bipartisan experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Obama, Clinton, Bush, and Reagan administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Also joining us, Juan Zarate. Juan, one of our nation's leading national security experts, is chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network and senior national security analyst for NBC News. His government experience includes service as deputy assistant to President George W. Bush and deputy national security advisor for combating terrorism. All right, Dennis, what makes your list of problematic aspects of President Trump's foreign policy?
We have a president, unlike any of the different presidents that I served, Republican and Democratic alike, who in response to a global pandemic basically forfeited American leadership. We played no role. Every one of the presidents that I served, Republican and Democratic alike, as different as they were ideologically, they would have been in the forefront of organizing the world to create a common approach, common standards, common principles, and then worked out how to implement this in terms of dealing with a pandemic that respects no borders. That was an abdication of American leadership, which also relates to a second point, and it gets to something Juan was saying. The perception of the U.S. as not being reliable. Partly that was a function of mixed messages, but it was also very clear. It wasn't clear what we stood for, and that to what is really a third element. The third element is the loss of America's belief in any values. We have stood for something. It contributed to our soft power. Hard power is very important, but you also need soft power. The two go together. The value of soft power is it makes you a form of attraction. When you state an objective, others are naturally drawn to it. It's easy to build coalitions. It expands our power. It doesn't weaken it. And it also makes our policies much more sustainable. We believe in something. We stand for something. The Trump foreign policy stood for nothing. We had no values that connected us to other countries. Every relationship was a function of short-term interest, how we could gain something, not how, in a sense, we stood for something. And it seems to me that has the potential. If he'd had a second term, the consequences, not just for broader alliances, but again, for the U.S. being a source of attraction, an alternative to authoritarianism. We see China trying to present now their model as being superior, authoritarianism as being superior. And a Trump administration, by its policies, by its lack of commitment to any set of values, did wonders for building up the appeal of that, especially at the same time when an administration revealed what was an enormous amount of incompetence.
Okay, that's quite a bill of indictment there. So let me ask both of you: when you look at these lists of achievements and failures or problems, what is going to last? What will outlive Donald Trump? What is Joe Biden likely to continue? What is Joe Biden going to work hard to reverse, and how difficult will it be to reverse? So it's really the longevity and the sustainability of this list of pluses and minuses of Donald Trump is what I'm getting at. Juan?
I do think the confrontation with China will continue, maybe not with the same sorts of tonalities or methods, but that China will persist. It's now a bipartisan agreement that China represents a fundamental challenge to America, maybe not as an enemy, but certainly as a competitor in the international space that has to be confronted more aggressively along with allies. I think the shift in the Middle East peace and what the perception of that means will persist.
Dennis, when you look at this overall legacy, is this the list of things that will survive it, or do you see other arenas in which the Trump legacy will live on, regardless of what Joe Biden tries to do?
Well, I think the interesting thing is there is a context that Trump also reflects, and Biden very much has to understand. Juan was getting at some of the things that that you already see the president-elect and those around him, like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, talk about. They clearly understand that to have a sustainable foreign policy, you have to have a wellspring of support here in the country, and the sense that somehow trade agreements put us at a disadvantage, the sense that multilateralism didn't always serve our interests. They will focus very much, I think, on trying to show what we're doing that responds to America's needs, but they'll also try to show that by with others, that in a sense lessens the costs for us. So there will be an effort, I think, to reestablish the U.S. as a good global citizen, but at the same time, as I was suggesting earlier, take advantage of the Trump legacy. Everyone sees what the consequence is when America doesn't lead. Biden himself has talked about it creates either a vacuum or chaos. And so he will say, okay, you see, everyone saw what happened when we didn't lead, but you also see that it's very difficult to sustain American leadership if others aren't fulfilling their roles and sharing in the responsibility. So I do think there'll be an effort to take advantage of what Trump did.
We've had this, in my view, regrettable post-Cold War tradition of one president coming in and throwing out the foreign policy of his previous president, saying what idiots they were. They didn't know the world. Now, you've actually been on both sides of this. Bush did it with Clinton. Obama did it with Bush. Trump did it with Obama. How can you run the world that way?
When one administration throws out everything that came before it, inevitably that itself sends a message of, or raises questions about reliability of the United States. If you're making commitments in an administration, those that are receiving those commitments need to know that the commitment outlasts the administration that is making it. And somehow we have to restore the idea that there is a degree of continuity here. And it's not easy because presidents run and they in a sense, want to reinvent the wheel because they pretty much want to say what came before me was wrong. I'm going to change everything. I've seen it in terms of, especially in the Bill Clinton administration after George H.W. Bush. In the first 6 months, there's an impulse to sort of throw everything out. 6 months into the administration, President Clinton said, you know, what President Bush was doing made a lot of sense, but it took 6 months to make that adjustment. You had Bush 43 react very much the same way in the first few months of his administration, that throwing out a lot of things that were being done by Clinton. Somehow, and this is not going to be easy this time because this has not been a traditional transition, somehow we have to use the transition periods more effectively to, in a sense, have a discussion between the outgoing administration and the incoming one about where things seem to be working and when they're not. It has to be a candid discussion. It's possible because, and in some ways, I would even say this may be a consequence of the Trump administration because so many of the professional foreign policy experts, I think, Republican and Democratic alike, now actually see they have much more in common in terms of their view of the world than the way Trump approached things. So I'm hopeful that this kind of recognition that, at least at the professional level, there is a level of commonality. I'm hopeful that in the future, we can kind of focus on the value of continuity and not simply throwing out everything that came before your administration?
So this is a fascinating conversation. I wish we could continue it, but we've run out of time. Dennis, Juan, I want to thank you very much. And I look forward to talking with you about the early days of the Biden administration in just a little while. Best wishes for 2021 to both of you. To paraphrase an old line, media, newspapers, and television can offer the first rough draft of history. So let's offer a rough draft of how history will view Donald Trump's foreign policy. Rhetorically, Trump was the first president in nearly 100 years to reflect an isolationist trend that has long been part of the American political tradition. That was the trend that closed America's borders to immigrants in the early 1920s, just after my own father squeaked in. It lost dominance after World War II, when America found itself as the dominant world power, and then rose to the occasion to fashion a new world, with institutions largely of our own making: the United Nations, NATO, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. It never disappeared, this theme, but it was never again victorious, until it found a champion in Trump's America First campaign. Operationally, Trump injected some important and salutary balance into certain foreign policy issues. His get tough policy on China didn't achieve all its goals, but it did correct some of the imbalance of the past. His effort to convince NATO members to fulfill promises on military spending was also a step in the right direction. So too his readiness to make Iran bear a heavy cost for its irresponsible regional behavior and its support for terrorism. In my view, however, Trump foreign policy suffered from overkill. Defending our borders more effectively turned into a crusade to dismantle America's historic role as a haven for refugees and worthy asylum seekers. And the images of families stripped apart from each other ran counter to who we are as a people. Restoring warm relations with Arab states, resentful of Barack Obama, a wise policy, morphed into turning a blind eye at their most egregious human rights excesses. Maximum pressure on Iran made sense, but it lacked any serious effort to fulfill the president's promise to seek a better, stronger, broader agreement with the mullahs. Strong support for Israel and its security threats, all welcome and legitimate in my view, turned into what was widely seen as an unnecessarily punitive approach to Palestinians. And the list goes on. I hope we get what I call a Goldilocks foreign policy from Joe Biden. Just as in the children's story, I hope we get an approach that is a hybrid of past policies, an outreach to Iran that is serious about arms control and about their unacceptable regional behavior, an approach to NATO that projects strong support for the alliance and demands more from each of its members, a policy on the human rights excesses of our friends that reflects our ideals not only because it's right, but because it gives us standing to target the even worse excesses of our adversaries. And the list goes on. Policymaking, of course, is not a children's story, but there is a lot of wisdom in what we teach our children. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الأثر الدائم لسياسة دونالد ترامب الخارجية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.